Okay, so I think that silence is a good signal that we should get started. Thanks so much for coming out. I know there's a lot of draws on your attention during Welcome Week, and so it's exciting to me to see so many people interested in artificial intelligence. And so I'm going to talk to you today about AI and university coursework, how you can use AI effectively and responsibly as a university student here at Acadia. And welcome to all the people who are joining online. It's great that you can tune in through that modality. Okay, so we're here because, as you know, in 2022, OpenAI, a tech company in San Francisco, released a platform called ChatGPT that allows you to interact with an artificial intelligence that we call a large language model. And what these large language models do is they produce really coherent on-topic text on basically, anything you want, right? So you can go to the ChatGPT interface and type in, write me a short essay comparing communism and capitalism, and you get, a really pretty good response, right? Like a B- sort of response. Okay. And when this was released, people were really astounded by the quality of the writing and the speed at which these AI produce text. And there was a lot of thought that this might be a threat to university coursework. Like, why would you ever write an essay when an AI can, simply do it for you? So what we're going to do today is actually look at this technology. We're going to start by just looking at how it works, because in order to understand how to use AI, you have to know a little bit about how it works, what it's good at, what it's not good at. I am a cognitive psychologist, so I'll compare large language models, ChatGPT, to the human mind. We'll examine how to use AI responsibly as university students, and then we'll look at some ethical issues associated with AI use. And please feel free to treat this as you would any lecture at Acadia. If you have a question, just raise your hand, and I'm happy to answer it on the fly. Who am I? How come I'm talking to you about AI? Well, I'm a cognitive psychologist. I study the psychology of language. A fancy way of saying that is that I'm a psycholinguist. And for the past 3 years or so, I've been doing research on human AI interactions. I'm very interested in how we affiliate with AI. Why do you find yourself thanking your Amazon Alexa for giving you the weather report? And in addition to my work here at Acadia, I also work for a technology company in the US called OneReach, helping researchers use artificial intelligence in their research program. Okay, so let's start with a very basic definition of what is artificial intelligence? Okay, so simply defined, it's any computer program that mimics some aspect of intelligent human behavior. So this could be like a self-driving car, right? It could be a chess program designed to beat Grandmaster Garry Kasparov, or it could be a robot that walks like a human. We're here today to talk about a very specific form of AI known as a large language model. And this is a form of artificial intelligence that produces language, typically text, in response to text, but also now you can speak to these AI and they'll respond with speech. And you enter a command and you get a really nice response. Here I've asked ChatGPT to describe psychoanalysis in the style of a Stephen King thriller, and it does a pretty good job at that. Now, we're all familiar with ChatGPT. This was the first interface that allowed people to interact with this form of AI, with large language models. But now there's half a dozen other platforms that allow you to interact with different AI, different large language models. So Claude from Anthropic, Perplexity, which you might have used, it's kind of like Google, but it incorporates AI, Microsoft Copilot, and Gemini from Google. Okay. And as we saw at the start, most of you have used an AI like ChatGPT before. So how do these AI work? How do they learn language and how do they produce language seemingly, so effortlessly? Well, large language models, what they're doing is through trial and error, they learn to complete text based on the text that came before. Okay, so for instance, if I gave you this sentence stem, the ball rolled down me, ... How would you complete this sentence? What word comes to mind? Hill. Why? It just feels right. Okay, and it feels right because, we're all experts at using language. We're all experts at speaking and writing, and we've encountered this sentence many times before, and we know that the right ending here, just, it's hill. That's what happens most of the time. And that's exactly what these models, these AI are learning during their training. And it's a trial and error process. So you give them some text to work with, and they start with a sentence stem, and they attempt to complete it. And so maybe they first try chair, and they look at their training text, and they realize that this sentence, it almost never ends with chair. And then they try slope, and okay, yeah, that sometimes happens, but only 3% of the time. And then finally, they land on hill. And this process just repeats over and over and over again. And it turns out if you give them enough text from the internet, they just get really good at completing sentences, producing language on the fly based on the text that you enter, the prompt that you enter. Right? And the model can just keep on going. The AI can just keep on going here. We could say, what's the most likely word to come next if this sentence continued? Probably and or but, right? And the AI will learn that, and then it can just keep on going. Came to a stop. So these artificial intelligence learn regularities in language that allow them to produce language based on language that you give them, a prompt that you give them. And that's all they're doing. It's kind of like if you've used like autocomplete on your phone, the same thing, but just like on steroids. Yeah.
This is the same word, so.
Yes, we'll get to this. So I think, so the question here was, text that we put online, researchers that, publish papers, those papers then get fed into ChatGPT, and then ChatGPT has knowledge of that information. And that's correct. And we'll talk about this later in the lecture. Everything you enter into that ChatGPT window is then used by OpenAI to make their AI better. Okay. So what text is used to train these AI? Well, it's text from the internet. We know a lot about an older large language model, GPT-3. This came out about 3 or 4 years ago. The newer versions that you can interact with through ChatGPT are a lot better. But GPT-3 was trained on text from the internet. So like Wikipedia, for instance, Reddit posts that have received more than 2 or 3 upvotes, corpuses of books, and Common Crawl, which is just a bot that sort of crawls around the internet and sucks up text. So these AI are learning language based on language that exists online. And newer large language models like GPT-4, which is available through ChatGPT, presumably that's basically being trained on the entirety of the internet. And so something to consider, right, is, is there biased information online? Of course, right? And so that bias is going to show up in the language that these models produce. And we'll talk about that later on in the lecture. Okay, so this all seems amazing, but let's talk a little bit about how we as humans learn and use language. So just like these large language models, we're really good at learning statistical patterns, statistical regularities in language. Our input is speech. Okay, or sign. This is primarily how we learn language. And lots of research in cognitive psychology has shown that really, really young infants, so 8-month-old infants, can very quickly learn patterns that help them perceive words, where a word starts and where it ends. It's actually kind of a hard thing to do. This is why speech recognition systems are kind of bad. But 8-month-old infants can do this. This is a paper that I make my students read, and they really hate me for it because it's very complex. So we're really good at learning statistical patterns in language. And we do this with actually a lot less input than these AI systems. So your average 10-year-old who can, speak and understand language really well has probably heard 1,000 times less linguistic input than, a standard large language model, a standard AI system. So as humans, we are as good and actually much better than these AI at learning and using language. The other thing we do, though, as humans is we develop what cognitive psychologists call mental representation. So ideas about how the world works, rules, for instance, the rules of math, right? I could ask you a math problem that you've never encountered before. Let's say I don't know, a simple math problem, like 47 plus 11, and everybody can use the rules of math to solve that problem. Okay, that's an example of a mental representation. We all understand how grammar works. You can produce a sentence that you've never produced before, right? Because we all have an implicit understanding of grammar and how to form well-formed sentences. I call this slower mode of thinking. Well, cognitive psychologists call this a slower mode of thinking. Is something that you develop in university, right? So in university, part of the reason why we're all here is to learn how to think sort of critically and in a slower, more methodical way. Okay, and it turns out that large language models like ChatGPT are really bad at this type of thinking. And I'll give you a really simple example. Okay, so the answer to this question is as straightforward as it seems. How many pairs of twins do you need in a room? So there's a 50% chance that 2 people have the same birthday. Okay, so how many pairs of twins is underlined, right? Jonah, you had your hand up. 2 sets of twins are yeah, exactly, because they have the same birthday, right? Okay, great. So simple problem. If we ask the same problem to any AI system, it gets it wrong. Okay, so we can ask GPT-4, the most advanced large language model from OpenAI. It says 22 pairs of twins. We can ask Claude from Anthropic. It says 27. I did this yesterday. We can ask Gemini from Google. It wants to know if the twins are identical or fraternal. Perplexity says 12 pairs of twins. So why are these sophisticated AIs getting this very simple problem wrong? Well, it turns out that, the way I've worded that problem, it looks like a very, very classic math problem I first learned about as an undergraduate many years ago at Bishop's University, and it's called the birthday problem. And in that problem, we're not dealing with twins, we're just dealing with people. Okay, and then the problem is much more complex. And you have to do, a bunch of math to get to the answer. And the answer is quite surprising. How many people do you need in a room? So there's a 50% chance that 2 people share the same birthday. It's about 22, okay? Now, AI systems have been extensively trained on this text from Wikipedia. So when they see my problem, all they know how to do is to complete text based on what's come before. And so my problem looks a lot like this problem. And so they give me the answer to this problem, a more complex problem. They can't recognize the simple rule that we all know, which is that twins necessarily share the same birthday. So cognitive psychologists like to think that we as humans think using 2 systems, okay? A very fast system, it's intuitive, it's based on learned associations. This is the type of system that you would use to solve 2 plus 2. Okay, 2 plus 2 equals 4. You're not doing any math when you solve that problem. You simply learned an association between an input and an output. This is what large language models like ChatGPT are doing. But we also have this other system, a slower system, a system that we develop in university that involves, learning the rules of logic, thinking in a slow way, and it allows us to solve more complex problems like 57 plus 14. There you're actually doing math to solve that problem. And so large language models, these AI systems, they're all system one. Okay, they can't think logically, they can't learn and apply rules. And what does this mean? It means that they make a lot of mistakes. The most likely text completion is not necessarily a correct answer. And these AI don't know the difference between right, factually correct, and wrong, factually incorrect. And so even if you tell them, make sure that everything you're giving me is factually right, they just can't solve that problem. They don't have the machinery to give you a factually correct answer 100% of the time. And so if you're using ChatGPT to produce text or computer code, you want to make sure that you extensively fact check it and correct the mistakes, because there will be mistakes. We often call these mistakes hallucinations, made up information. And we've already seen, many cases in the media of, for instance, lawyers using ChatGPT in court cases, and it makes up, a bunch of fake case law, and then they get into trouble. Computer programmers using ChatGPT to produce computer code that's riddled with errors. News organizations trying to replace human journalists with AI, and the AI produces news articles, right, that have a bunch of made-up information. So it just doesn't work. All right, so let's talk about how we actually can use these tools effectively and responsibly in university. So large language models, AI, and university coursework. So the first thing you need to know is that here at Acadia, we do not have a set AI policy. Okay, it's going to vary from professor to professor to professor. So if you want to use AI for a particular class, ask your professor. Tell them the use case. This is how you want to use it, and make sure that it's all right. And it's not that professors are sort of old and stodgy and anti-technology. It's that courses have specific learning outcomes, and AI might jeopardize those learning outcomes. I teach a senior writing seminar where students in science learn how to write effectively, right? And if you used AI in that course, well, then you're not learning anything at all, okay? And so in that particular class, I don't let students use AI to generate text from scratch. Generally speaking, just assume that you can't use AI unless your professor has said otherwise, or you've spoken with them and explained how you want to use it, and they say that that's okay. And because AI is so prone to making up information, I just generally recommend that you just don't use it to generate text or computer code for submission, okay? Because it's very likely just going to lead to a bad mark, because that text or computer code will be riddled with errors and potentially made up information. Okay, so let's talk about ways in which we can use AI responsibly. I find that AI, large language models like ChatGPT, give you the best results when you actually give them text to work with. So you're sort of constraining the text that they're working with. So at the start of the lecture, I was talking about how infants are so good at learning regularities in language, right? 8-month-old infants can do this. I make my students read this very complex paper. They hate me for it because it's very hard. The first time I tried to read it, it took me like a couple weeks to actually get into it. And so this is where AI could actually be kind of helpful, because you could ask an AI system to give you a summary, right, of the paper, to give you enough context to then get into the paper and actually read it and actually get something from it. Okay, and what's nice about these AI systems is you can ask for summaries at a specific level. So you could say, for instance, summarize this really tough paper at a grade school level, and it'll give you that basic summary. Now, this is one of those cases, right, that whether or not you can use AI for summary is going to vary from professor to professor to professor. Okay, in English, for instance, I could very well see a professor saying, no, 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 you cannot use AI for summary because the whole point of this class is for you to read texts that are open for interpretation, that have some deep meaning that necessarily might not be captured correctly by an AI system. So again, talk to your professors before you use AI in this way as a tool for summary. We're seeing a lot of students use AI for test preparation, and I love this use case. One of the things that we know in cognitive psychology is that passive review does not benefit your memory for information in any way at all. So passive review, and when I say passive review, think about biology class, like flipping through flashcards, right? Trying to memorize strange biological terms. We know that this form of review does not actually benefit your memory. It's actually much better to test yourself repeatedly, so to do practice tests. And this is where AI is actually really useful. So what some students here at Acadia are doing is they're taking their notes, so notes that they've written, and they're giving them to ChatGPT, and they're telling ChatGPT to generate university level test questions for them. And the key here, if you're going to do this, is to tell the AI to restrict its output to the provided information. Okay, so use only the provided material. You don't want the AI system to bring in sort of random, potentially made up information from its general knowledge. You want the output restricted to the text that you've given. Okay, so here I've given ChatGPT some class notes from my lecture on the history of cognitive psychology that some students in this room have taken. And it does a pretty good job of generating some practice problems. Now, are these questions as challenging as the questions I give to my students? Probably not, right? But using them as a study aid is far more beneficial than passively reviewing information. And so I really see these AI systems as a very useful tool when it comes for test preparation. I asked some of my senior students, how they're using ChatGPT. Basically, all of them said test prep. Some students are using it for feedback on work that they've done before they submit it. So one of my students said that she gives ChatGPT her essays and the grading rubric and asks for feedback on her work to look for holes to make it stronger. Other students are using it as a tool for formatting references. And then finally, as a tool for troubleshooting computer code. Okay, and you'll note that in all of these cases, right, the students aren't asking it to generate text or computer code from scratch. They're giving it information, text or computer code that they've generated, right, and asking, for practice problems or help or a critique. Okay, but again, you want to speak to your individual professors about, what's allowed for their classes because there are some AI use cases that could jeopardize the learning outcomes of a particular course. If you decide to use AI, if your prof says that it's all right, then you want to cite AI. Okay, and so the Modern Language Association, this is the citation style. It's very common in the humanities. It requires that you actually include the prompt that you use to generate the text, so what you entered into the ChatGPT window. So imagine you're writing a paper, right, on whether or not artificial intelligence believes common myths. So for instance, that people who are more creative are right-brained, okay, and you ask ChatGPT, does AI believe the myth that more creative people are right-brained? ChatGPT said, ... So you've said in the paper that you used ChatGPT and here's the output, and then you want to cite ChatGPT with the prompt that you used. For the American Psychological Association, the common citation style in the social sciences, in psychology, you want to cite AI as software. And again, you want to mention in the text that you've used AI. Okay, so when asked, are more creative people right-brained? ChatGPT said, ... Okay, so be sure to mention in the text that you've used ChatGPT, and then in this case, you're citing it as a piece of software. Okay, so let's talk about some issues that are associated with using AI. The first and probably best known is that of bias. So large language models, artificial intelligence systems, they only know what they've been trained on. And if the text they've been trained on includes biased material, they're going to produce biased material. Okay, and so in ChatGPT, it has this cool function that you can ask it to produce images. And it produces images in a very similar way to how it produces text. And so here I've asked it to create an image of two Canadians talking. And of course, it's the most stereotypical image of Canadians that you've ever seen. Growing up in Southern Ontario in Mississauga, this doesn't look very much like, the Canadians I grew up with, okay? So any bias in the underlying training text is going to show up in the output. So that's something to watch out for. A lot of people are using AI now for note-taking. So Zoom, for instance, has a built-in AI note-taker. This, is superficially a really nice use case. If you have like a disability, well, then, here's a note-taker that can help you out, right? But we have to recognize that just like humans, these artificial intelligence systems prefer certain voices. Okay, so AI note takers are going to ignore people with accents, people who stutter, or simply people who just don't speak that much in a meeting. So that's something to keep in mind that, as a note taker, they show bias, the same bias that humans show. AI is bad for the climate. There's no way around this at all. Training these AI systems requires a huge amount of energy, and that energy primarily comes from burning fossil fuels. Okay, so training GPT-3, for instance, emitted the equivalent CO2 as 600 transatlantic flights, and larger models are definitely just as bad for the environment. A ChatGPT query uses about 10 to 15 times more energy than a standard Google search. Okay, and again, that energy primarily comes from burning fossil fuels. Until we move to a world of complete renewable energy, it's always going to be the case that artificial intelligence is just bad for the climate. And then finally, these AI systems, they really need your data. So what's really interesting about large language models is that they need human data, human text, human images to get better. If you try to train them on AI-generated text or images, they actually break. They start falling apart. And so it's important to understand that everything you enter into that ChatGPT window is going to, OpenAI's head offices and being used to retrain their large language models to make them better. Okay, so don't be an unpaid worker, right? Your thoughts have value. We're already seeing instances of artists, for instance, suing AI companies for training their systems on their art without permission. The New York Times is suing OpenAI and Microsoft for using their articles to train their AI systems. So that's something to keep in mind. Everything you put in that ChatGPT window is very likely going to be used to train new AI models, and it actually becomes public, right? It becomes part of that AI's knowledge, which can then be shared with anybody. Okay, so we've come to the end of the talk. I'm just going to quickly review, and then we can jump to some questions. So large language models like ChatGPT are AI that produce text in response to text. They're simply producing text based on the text that came before. They learn statistical patterns and language that allow them to do this. Unlike the human mind, these systems can't fact check themselves. They struggle with logic, with reasoning, and this means that they make many mistakes and they often produce made up information. Here at Acadia, we don't have a set AI policy, so be sure to ask your professors before you use AI for a particular class. And then finally, what are the costs and benefits, right? Does it make sense? If you can get to the same answer using a standard Google search, just do that, right? It's a little bit better for the climate, and there's less risk of made up information. All right, and that's the end of the talk. I would love to answer questions if you have them. Yeah, that's a great question. And these AI are, so the question was, how would, for people online, how would ChatGPT provide feedback on an essay if it can't use logic and reasoning? So these AI have been trained on such huge sort of quantities of text that they're basically like, if you input your essay into ChatGPT, it's comparing that text to something it's seen before. It might not be identical, but it's close enough. It's close enough that it gives an answer that seems kind of reasonable, right? It seems kind of on topic and, something that could potentially be helpful to you when it comes to sort of revising that paper. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's a good question. So let me see if I can sort of wrap my head around this. So you're inputting your essay to ChatGPT, which it then becomes public, right? And so another student could potentially come up with the same text. Is that the idea? And then use that text? Yes, okay, yeah. So standard plagiarism checkers, what they're doing is they're comparing the text that you enter to text that exists online, right? Now, when you share your information with ChatGPT, that text isn't like immediately publicly available. It's sort of contained within OpenAI's servers and used to retrain their models. So an exact replication of your text won't appear somewhere else on the internet, but the ideas, the language that you use in your text might be used in responses from the AI at some point in the future. That probably wouldn't ping a standard plagiarism detector. But again, I think it's important to stress that you don't want to be sharing anything with these AI systems that you don't want to be public, because that information sort of will get out there. Yeah, and OpenAI and other artificial intelligence companies have. So the question was, are there any biases for people online? Are there any biases that we're aware of that sort of commonly appear in these AI systems? Early versions of these AI systems produced much more biased text. And these AI companies, what they do is they employ humans to actually go through this text and tell AI systems that the output is biased. Okay, this is called reinforcement learning with human feedback. And through this approach, they're able to generate responses that show less bias over time. But it's a very labor-intensive process that many of these companies employ to reduce bias in the text that they spit out. Yeah, so the question for people online was, how do AI detection tools work and how good are they? The short answer is they don't really work. There are no good AI detection tools. The best AI detector is just that as a professor, the paper, and I've encountered some work that was clearly AI generated. The paper contains information that's off topic, often made up. and just factually incorrect. And, you know, when I encounter that, I don't accuse the student of using AI. They just end up with a not great mark, right? Because the paper just didn't answer the question, right? These AI systems, they lack sort of the context in which the material was learned. And that's really important for answering a lot of the questions that you're asked by professors, right? Like, what was discussed in class? That's what many profs want to see in, you know, the papers that you submit. And these AI systems will never have that knowledge necessarily, just because there's no way that they have access to it. So the answer to your question is there isn't a good AI detector. For the faculty who are listening, and this is problematic, obviously, for open-ended assignments like creative writing projects. And so we're seeing faculty moving towards Google Docs, where you can actually track the progress of the paper, you know, every step of the way, to see how it develops from start to finish. But yeah, generally speaking, there's the best sort of tell is that the text itself has a bunch of errors in it. Yeah, so we do this too, right? To some extent, so right now when you're perceiving my speech, right, you don't have to think about the words that I'm saying, you just understand. And you're doing this through associative memory, okay? And this is very similar to how these systems work. But if I give you a more challenging problem, then you're able to think more slowly about it, logically about it, you know, apply rules that you've learned. And sort of this slower mode of thinking, this is what these AI systems struggle with. So as speakers and writers of language, we are doing a lot of what these AI systems are doing, but we have this other system that we can draw on that allows us to think more slowly and logically, allows us to apply rules when we need to. Does that kind of make sense? We can produce sentences that we've never produced before. We can solve math problems that we've never encountered before. These AI systems can't do that. They only know what they've been trained on. They're all associative memory. They can't think slowly and logically about problems. They can't think in a deterministic way. Does that make sense? Question in the back? It's a great question. And so the question for people at home is, you know, are faculty changing the way they assess students to account for AI? And I think they are. We're seeing faculty here at Acadia incorporate AI into their instruction. So have students, for instance, generate text from ChatGPT and then have them fact check it, right? See what the viewpoint ChatGPT takes and why it might take that viewpoint. We're seeing more faculty ask for, you know, every sort of stage of the essay, right? From, you know, the initial idea, you know, through each of the drafts to the finished final product. And we are seeing more sort of, you know, oral presentations, which I think is a good thing. The nice thing about being at Acadia, at a small sort of liberal arts college, right, is that we have smaller classes. And so we can ask you, right, to do some of these more complex we can use some of these more complex assessment methods. This is much more challenging at larger institutions where all your classes are hundreds of students. And so I think that's, you know, a benefit to being a student here at Acadia. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question for people at home, if you didn't hear it, was that, you know, are there other deterministic AI systems that we could plug into these large language models to make them better? And to some extent, that's happening. So for instance, like if you ask ChatGPT to do complex math, okay, it can't do that. It doesn't know how to think deterministically. It doesn't know the rules of math. It only knows how to complete text based on what came before. But these systems are being trained to recognize, oh, this is a math problem. So let's launch another computer program, a calculator program, you know, that actually does math that can solve this problem for us. So we're seeing sort of these AI systems being combined with more conventional computer programs that think deterministically. If you haven't heard that word deterministic before, it simply means that, we know with 100% certainty what the answer is, right? 7 plus 3 is 10, right? That's a deterministic problem. These AI systems, they think probabilistically. They're never 100% certain. All right, well, thank you so much for coming out. It's so great to see so many students, so many first-year students out for what is effectively an academic lecture on a day when you're not supposed to have lectures. And yeah, please do chat with your profs about using AI. Thank you.